like to welcome you. This webinar is being brought to you by Cure. The information provided is for your own use, but it's not legal advice. Cure does not represent individuals. So if you do need legal advice, please consult a lawyer who can represent you. And this is the third of our 5 webinar series, so please check out our website for more information about the other ones. And I think we'll just get started in a second here. I know some of the folks who are in the waiting room already saw this, but good housekeeping info to start with. We seem to have leveled off here, so if you want to, we'll get started. So again, welcome everybody. You are at the Cure Data Center's water webinar, part 3 of our Cure Data Center webinar series. And if you aren't familiar with who we are, Cure protects and restores resilient communities and landscapes by harnessing the power of the people who care about them. We're an environmental nonprofit based in Minnesota with staff working out of 11 communities across the state. As we enter our 34th year, our work is really becoming at the nexus of climate, energy, and water, and is often facilitated through the lens of rural democracy. So today we were planning on having Hannah Richardson, who's the water policy manager from Clean Wisconsin, with us, but unfortunately, due to unforeseen circumstances, Hannah couldn't join us tonight. So you will be hearing instead from myself. My name is Sarah Mooradian. I should have introduced myself at the top. I'm the Government Relations and Policy Director for Cure, and also my colleague Peg Furshong, who is the Director of Special Projects here at Cure. And I think I'm going to turn it over to you now, Peg.
Thanks, Sarah. Welcome, everyone. We're really excited to have you. And as Sarah said, this is the third in a 5-part installment on everything you want to know about data centers and more, right? I'm just going to set the stage for tonight. This is a basic overview of what we're going to cover. So we're going to talk about water use in general, where we get the water, what is the water used for in a data center, what happens to the water, and then we're going to talk a little bit about what's happening in Minnesota. We're going to talk a little bit about our community engagement, and then we're going to leave time at the end for some question and answer. As you can see by the slide in front of us, data centers is actually a global issue, not just a local issue, not just an issue that we deal with in the United States, but data centers have been around for a long time. And we're going to talk tonight about data centers that have been in Minnesota, and then the data centers that are coming to Minnesota. The United States is a global leader on data centers. This is a slide that just really illustrates that. You know, we're 10 times the number of data centers of any other country in the world. Data centers are one of the top most water-consuming industries in the United States. And only about 50% of data centers actually track their water use. You know, tonight, as I mentioned, we're going to talk about the kinds of data centers, specifically hyperscale data centers is what we're going to focus on tonight. Minnesota has had data centers in the state for more than 2 decades. We have about 60 of them currently in the state. But we have a new type of data center that's a hyperscale data center. And what that really means is it's the kind of data center, they're very large, and they are used for artificial intelligence and predictive analytics. Another thing in setting the stage that I just want to explain is that data centers are very water consumptive and energy consumptive. And they have to have redundancies of both because they have to have access to water and energy 24/7. So as Sarah mentioned, our colleague Hannah is not able to join us tonight. So you'll have to give me a little grace, but I think I can cover what she was going to share with us tonight. Probably not as well, but we will hit all the high points and be available to answer questions after we're done. Data centers use water both directly and indirectly. And what exactly does that mean? So directly really focuses on water that is used on the facility at the data center. So when they're applying for a permit, they probably would only be applying for water for direct use. They wouldn't be applying for water for indirect use. But indirect use of water would be the water used to generate the energy to create the electricity that runs the data center, and also could be used in the manufacturing of the microchips that the processors need, because that's a consumptive process as well. And it's really important and complicated. And I guess one of the things in setting the stage I want to share with you is it's really difficult to get a handle on the water footprint of data centers because of this indirect and direct volleying game that we play. So when a data center applies for a permit and they ask for water, depending on the cooling system that they choose, sometimes there's more than one, would indicate how much water they're going to use. So if they use a cooling system that would be focusing on air cooling or pulling cool ambient air from outside in to cool the electronic equipment in the data center, that's going to need a lot more energy to create electricity to run those fans. It might not use as much water on site, but it creates a greater demand for water in the indirect generation of that additional electricity. And so that's why it's really complicated to kind of understand the full footprint. The other thing that's important is there's two ways to use water, and that would be a withdrawal or a consumption of water. And so the difference between the two is withdrawal is what's taken out to be used. Potentially some of that water could be returned or not used or used again. But when it's consumed, it's like evaporated or it transpires and is gone completely. So like when they're using cooling systems that have cooling towers and they use water to cool and it heats up and then it's gone because it evaporates out into the atmosphere, that would be consumption. So there's multiple cooling systems, and the interesting thing about data centers is that it's just a rapid race to be the biggest, the best, and make the most money, I guess. And so the technology is ever evolving, and it's a rapid amount of information to keep up with. And so when we look at different cooling systems, there's a variety of cooling systems. There's mechanical or air, like we spoke about earlier. There's a closed loop system. There's chillers with refrigerants. There's direct to chip, and there's immersion. Probably not going to go into detail in all of these. We can talk a little bit about some things you might want to know about them. As we mentioned earlier, the air cooling, Minnesota is desirable to locate because we're in a northern climate, and perhaps their cooling systems might be operating more seasonally, and they might be relying on mechanical air to offset their water use by bringing in that air to cool their equipment that way. Another way that's illustrated here on the slide is a closed loop system. And a closed loop system, it has quotes around it because it indicates maybe that it's closed, but it's not entirely closed because there's multiple circuits, and it can be multiple circuits in a closed loop system. Depends on how they design it. Typically, at least one of the circuits or the loops is closed, but it also has other loops that aren't necessarily closed. So if you look at the illustration here, this is an example of one possible cooling system where at the bottom, if you start at the bottom of the slide and you're bringing cooler water in to the system from the outside, and then in the chiller with the green arrows that move around, you've got that's your closed loop system that might have a coolant in it. But if the closed loop system doesn't interact with another circuit or loop, that closed loop system would always stay hot. So you can see the evaporator on the bottom and the condenser on the top, and that just provides an opportunity for the closed loop system to recharge and cool off so that it can circulate through the equipment and cool it again. And then if you go from the condenser up to the cooling tower, that's where you would have an open loop system where you would potentially have the evaporation, and that would be an example of consumption. The water that goes through there wouldn't be returned back to the system because it would evaporate out into the atmosphere. Chillers would be somewhat like an air conditioner, and they would have refrigerants, and there's different chemicals that they might use for that. The closed loop system also uses chemicals in that closed loop system. The direct to chip is another method that has like a flat plate and has a cooling process that runs over that flat plate to cool the plate in the equipment. And then immersion is probably like it seems, it's like a tank where they run the loops down into the colder water that recirculates and cools the loops off and brings the loop back up out into the equipment to cool it off. So those would be just different examples. I'm not a scientist, but I've watched a lot of the videos and I've tried to absorb as much as I can. And oftentimes there's a combination of these different cooling systems in a plant because they do have to have redundancies, and their business model might, like being in the northern states, like I had said, their business model might have the ability for them to take advantage of seasonally taking the cool air from the outside in and utilizing it that way. So I thought this was an interesting slide that Hannah had shared with us about indirect offsite use. And it really takes 3 different types of cooling systems, tower, pond, and once through. And then it identifies the fuel type that's generating the electricity. So it would be coal, natural gas, and nuclear. And it clearly articulates with whichever cooling system they're using what the withdrawal is that they need to run the equipment. And then once they've completed their operation, how much of that withdrawal was actually consumed. And as you can see, it's very different depending on the fuel source and the cooling type as to how much water is needed to run it, and then actually how much water is actually used. So somebody might ask, where, if a project was coming to your community, where would a developer or a company, a data center company, get their water from? Well, the most common way to get water is through a municipality. That offers a lot of conveniences for the project in the sense that the city's already got an appropriation, or the municipality's already got appropriation through the state for the water. They might not have enough for the amount of water that the data center project might need. So they might need to expand or increase their appropriation permit. And the other thing that makes going to a municipality appealing is they basically, as long as the municipality has room to add them on to their allocation permit, generally it's a very short time turnaround. There's not a permitting process to go through that a normal developer would have to go through. And then I would say also, because they are going through a municipality, it's important that they consider like what they're paying for the water and how they communicate to the community. A lot of times, this is a point where communities can be concerned about what might happen in the event of drought and conservation measures that a municipality might have to implement. What does that mean for the users that are currently there, both business, industrial, residential, when you're adding a large water user onto the system? Another way to do it is to apply for their own allocation permit. So like in Minnesota, that would be with the DNR. And they would have to go through that process of the application and the review of that through the state agencies. In other parts of the country that are much more water scarce, it's not uncommon for projects like this to have to bring their own water or find creative ways to get water. So co-locating a data center project near a wastewater treatment plant is an option that some projects have done, where they would then build a plant or a part add on to their facility, water recycling, purification process. So they could take the treated wastewater, bring it in, treat it again, because likely they have to probably purify it to a point that it's usable. Data centers require really very pure form of water because of all of the corrosive properties that water actually has on their equipment. And so they could treat the wastewater, they could use it, and then they could treat it again before they discharge it would be the ideal situation. This oftentimes mitigates concerns by the locals about water use, especially like in places like California, Arizona, New Mexico, Nevada, where they just don't have the water for these big projects. And quite frankly, I think that's why we're seeing them in the upper Midwest, because we are on the borders of the Great Lakes. And Minnesota has this perception of being water rich, or the land of 10,000 lakes. That isn't necessarily true. There's certain parts of the state that don't have abundant water supplies, and they pipe their water in from out of state. So, but the perception is that we're water rich. So what happens to the water? That's a good question, right? So depending on the cooling system, sometimes it evaporates. Depending on the cooling system, and if they're treating the water and they discharge the water into surface sources, that could be a lake, a river, a stream. Concerns might be the temperature, because when they're discharging it, it's likely at a warmer temperature than it would normally be in the water itself, which can disrupt the ecosystem. There's a lot of ecology that lives in that water and can be impacted just with subtle temperature changes. We're seeing concern about that down in the Farmington area because they have a trout stream that runs near a proposed data center site. And, you know, it's one of the very few trout streams in Minnesota. So they want to be really careful that it's not going to disrupt that ecosystem. When we look at wastewater discharge, we think about a wastewater treatment plant. And what exactly are wastewater treatment plants designed for? They're designed to process biological waste, right? So they need a certain anaerobic condition in order to break down those biologicals. So if you all of a sudden have a huge influx of additional water, just even if the water didn't have anything in it or any concerns, just the sheer volume would disrupt those conditions that the wastewater treatment plant needs to dissolve the biological solids. But likely there's going to be a temperature change and there's going to be additives to that water. When we're looking at a data center they're looking at anti-corrosive chemicals, typically some of the refrigerants have glycol class additives or certain PFAS, the F class PFAS. Wastewater treatment plants aren't designed to pull those chemicals out of the system. And so they would likely need wastewater infrastructure upgrades in order to deal with those. If it's even possible, I'm not sure. But we do know that these chemicals are in the water because water has a lot of like lime and scaling, and that's really hard on the equipment and breaks it down. And so they look for ways to like treat the equipment and the water to limit or reduce those costs in replacement of infrastructure. So likely the wastewater treatment plant would need some kind of upgrade to their infrastructure. So here in Minnesota, when we take this down to like what we're looking at in Minnesota, I think some of the challenges we have is the purview of water. You know, at the federal level, we have a Department of Energy. We don't have a Department of Water at the federal level. In our state, we don't have one office that oversees water either. We have 4 state agencies that look at water. We have the Department of Health, Department of Agriculture, Minnesota Pollution Control Agency, and the Minnesota Department of Natural Resources. All have different responsibilities for water in Minnesota, which in some ways probably has benefits, but it also can have challenges because sometimes you're talking to someone about a concern, but it's not their area that they can help solve the problem. And so then you have to go to someone else. Maybe part of the problem is solved by Department of Health, but part of the problem is DNR. And it can be a lot of passing around the issue as opposed to being able to go and figure out what you need to do. So when we think about how water is used in Minnesota, this was the latest water distribution or categorization of water from 2024 that was on the website this week. So the DNR, this is based on water appropriation permits. The DNR tracks these 5 areas. We're hoping that they're going to add a 6th area and track data centers, but I'm not sure if that's going to be possible or not. But this is pretty much pre-hyperscale data center numbers. That 505 likely is going to grow substantially as we see these hyperscale data centers come online, just because to generate the energy that's needed for these data centers is very water consumptive. Again, indirect water for the project. As a result of some of the legislation that was passed last year around data centers, one of the things was that appropriation permit fee structure was increased slightly. But as you look at this chart, you can really see that by and large, industrial users do not really pay very much money for their water. You know, you've got your base rate for your permit, and then $6 for each million gallons. $6 for a million gallon, it just doesn't seem like a lot. So it's better than it was, but it wasn't that much of an increase. And, you know, I think as we move into the next couple decades, we're going to see that the value of water is going to increase exponentially. We're already seeing this in other parts of the country, and that's why these data centers are coming here, because they choose to locate where they can get cheap land, cheap energy, cheap water. And this is why. I just want to show you that infrastructure map that is from 2025 that really kind of guides, it's the data center footprint and kind of tells you where the hotspots or the hubs are for data centers. And you'll see on the left, you'll see Nevada, the Phoenix area. Down in Texas, it looks like just northeast of Salt Lake City. And then Virginia. Virginia actually per capita has more data centers, I think, than surely anywhere in the United States, but possibly the world, because there's just a lot of data centers there. Ground zero for data centers, they say. If you look at the Great Lakes region, you'll see that there's some emerging yellow dots, or widening yellow dots. That's where data centers are operating. And if you look in Minnesota, we have about 60 data centers. Sarah's going to talk a little bit about that. Currently in 8 markets, and 53 of those are in the Twin Cities. So that's why you have that big yellow dot in the metro area there. We have 2, I think, in Duluth, 1 in Bemidji, 1 in the St. Cloud area, 1 in Alexandria, 1 in Barnum. I think most of them, and the majority of them are in the Twin Cities area. I'm going to hand this over now to my colleague, Sarah, and she is going to talk a little bit more about Minnesota.
Great. Thank you so much, Peg. So as Peg said, we do have data centers here in Minnesota. We've had them for several decades, but they're really more of that traditional type, not the type of hyperscale data centers that are really getting a lot of media attention right now. We don't have any operational hyperscale data centers in Minnesota yet, but there's a lot of interest across the state. We're seeing a lot of it right now kind of concentrated in the South Metro area, just outside kind of the metro area, Dakota County especially, but really it is happening across the state. So this is just a brief list of some of the projects, hyperscale projects that we're aware of. The Meta facility down in Rosemont is the furthest along. Some of these are kind of on pause as there's different litigation or just kind of have just started the process of potentially kind of coming online or being reviewed. So, if you've been paying attention at all or attended our previous webinars, you know that there's a lot of secrecy around these proposed projects, but we are able to estimate some information primarily from AUARs. And for those who don't already know, an AUAR stands for Alternative Urban Area-Wide Review. It's a type of environmental review, alternative environmental review that is available here in Minnesota. It's really intended to be more of like a tool for local governments to kind of plan what they might do with land that they have, how they might develop and continue developing their community. It's really not intended for specific projects. There are ways you can do specific projects under it, but the intent is really to be a planning document, not for hyper-specific projects. So from those AUARs, um, this is some of the information that we got. This is also courtesy of Star Tribune reporters who have been via the same method using AUARs to kind of figure out what some of these proposed facilities that we know of, just kind of comparing their size, whether they're getting groundwater or surface water, if we know, and then also the estimated water usage. So I think this is really, it shows that it's not always dependent. The amount of water that's being used isn't always dependent on size. They're not always closely linked. It also shows that there's a lot of unknowns still left. There's a couple sources that we don't know where, for example, the Amazon facility in Becker would have gotten, would get its water from. We don't know how much water might be used at that facility or the tract facility down in Cannon Falls. So it's just kind of a way to show you that although there's a lot of proposed development that's being discussed, there's still a lot of unknowns. So next steps, we've covered a lot of ground, you're probably wondering what's next. So staying informed, continuing to educate yourself, coming to webinars like this. We've got some great one-pagers that we already have available. And we've got a website, a web page that we're working on and we'll have up soon so that we can continue to kind of share out the information that we learn ourselves. Also, follow your zoning and planning board minutes. That's where a lot of the discussions about what kind of development your local community is thinking about. That's where a lot of the initial discussions about potential data center development happen. You'll also get some information about if you pay attention to the local government and kind of the goings on there, that's also a great way to learn about AUARs if they come up. And you might get some information about proposed data centers there. Also, talk with your lawmakers. So the Minnesota State Legislature will be back in session starting February 17th. CURE and several other organizations have been working hard on some proposed legislation to really try and close some of these gaps that Peg was talking about today, to make sure that Minnesotans are kind of driving this conversation, that we're making sure that our water resources and our communities and our access and availability and the health of our waters are protected. And then also support organizations doing this work like CURE. So that was a whirlwind. I don't know if Peg has anything else to discuss, but really appreciate you all tuning in.
Thanks, Sarah. I would just say that there are a couple different nonprofits doing this work, but nonprofits generally write grants to fund their work, and they're supported by people like you. So if you learned something today and really enjoyed what you experienced tonight, a donation is always a great way to help us continue to do our work and move this work forward. So we appreciate that. This is just some quick contact information. And as Sarah had said, we're going to transition over into the Q&A, and then we'll answer as many of those questions as we can. And if we can't answer them, we will find the answers for you and we will respond back after the webinar tonight.
Excellent. I will go ahead and take at least, we'll just start with the Q&A. We've got two questions in there so far. So the first one from Paul, why does nuclear use more water than coal or natural gas? And that is a great question that I'm going to tell you I don't know the answer to. So that is one that we will report back. And Peg said it, but we will send out, we'll find the answers and we'll send you an individual email with the answer when we're able to.
It is a good question, Paul. And what we do know is it is the most water consumptive energy generation source that there is, but we will dig more into that for you.
Yep. Second question, how are you defining a data center in terms of power consumption, in megawatts or something else? So that's a great question. So there aren't easily defined or there aren't well-established definitions of what like a hyperscale data center is or one of these co-location type data centers. But so in Minnesota, generally, our laws establish that a data center is something that has is designed for a capacity of 100 megawatts or greater. And that seems to be kind of the threshold that a lot of folks understand. If you're using more than 100 megawatts, you're probably a hyperscale data center. But there isn't anything that's hard and fast rule. Often over several 100,000 square feet, as you maybe saw on the slide with the water use from the AUARs, all of them were over, I think, 500,000 square feet. So it kind of depends. This question may be for you, Peg. So does most water come from groundwater or from municipal water systems?
Most of the water permits, most common, are through the municipal system, so some sort of water utility. Kind of depends on where they're located. If they're rural enough and they can't access the utility, then they would probably source the water from a well. But other than that, they choose to go to a municipality if they can.
Great, thank you. Then we've got a question. Speaking of donations, are there any groups that fund communities in legal fights? If it goes to it, what organizations might do pro bono expert testimony? That's a great question. I can at least answer kind of the second part of that. So I'll tell you nationally, folks are really trying to kind of get organized, find the experts that are out there. There are people who know, very specific pieces like Hannah. We've got somebody in Minnesota, Dr. Carrie Jennings, who's, knows a lot about kind of hydrology and the way water works. And so folks are working nationwide to try and get those experts, kind of the stable of experts put together to the extent that they're willing and able to do pro bono work is kind of an open question.
So I think I will answer Patricia's question. She says, if coming from a town well, what are some of the risks to the township, potential risks? So depending on where the well, how deep the well is and what aquifer it's drawing from, it depends on how many people are on that aquifer and drawing from that aquifer, because aquifers are big and they don't always respect political boundaries. I think you have to think about like what are the cumulative impacts and who's all using the groundwater that the wells are coming from. So if there's other industries in your area, if there's heavy agricultural, if there's animal operations versus irrigation, those are all things that draw a lot of water from the aquifer. And so some of the things that could be considered best practices if you have your own well is to get it tested for depth and volume ahead of time as a baseline, so that when a large water user comes and if there does tend to be problems with the well, you have a baseline to at least know where you were before the withdrawal started. I'm not a hydrologist, but some of the things that have been shared are sometimes when you have a rapid withdrawal from a large user, it will extract other contaminants from the soil. So like you might have an arsenic bleed, for example, that you wouldn't normally have, because if you had a quick withdrawal, it might create a vacuum and pull that in. You might have a collapse. You might see your water quality change. You might have like muddier water, or you might have water that isn't coming out clean. Those are all things that potentially could happen. In some cases, wells have just gone dry and they've had to dig deeper wells or try to find another aquifer that they can tap into.
Great, thank you, Peg. I will, let's see, sorry, I'm trying to make sure Patricia's wasn't related to the question we just answered. So yes, another one, do you have recommendations for regulatory reform at local or state, at the local or state level for hierarchy of needs during a drought, real-time or near real-time monitor usage, fines slash withdrawal of permit if breaking the law, banning NDAs, etc. Yes, yes, we do. So those are some of the things that are kind of up for discussion that we're bringing forward. Again, Cure with some of our other partner orgs throughout the state are bringing forward and really want the state to consider. It does depend on, so that is at the state level. It does kind of depend on, this is just for Minnesota, what your state already has in place, what the local government is willing to do. A lot of times we've seen that local governments are really interested in bringing in a perceived great new development, construction jobs, perceived tax revenue, and so maybe aren't interested in kind of putting additional parameters on this new business. But I think that there's real discussions to be had at the local level as well about what a community is willing to kind of give up in return for that. And that I'll plug our final webinar is about community benefits agreements, and that's kind of part of the discussion is what is the local government interested, what is the local community interested in getting in return for hosting one of these, this or any type of facility. Peg, I don't know if you have anything to add to that. Okay.
No, I think that that is one of the questions that we have in Minnesota on the hierarchy of needs during drought, because I think one of the challenges we have is even though there might be expectations or even sometimes rules on the book, they're not always enforced, or there's not even a way to enforce them. There's not a system in place to enforce them. And that's one of the things that we're trying to do with some of the data center legislation that we're hoping to see happen in the future is not to have expectations that can't be managed or enforced, or people have authority to enforce, because we see that in other parts of our government that can be challenging. I think that I will, some of the questions that we're seeing might borderline on asking legal advice. There's a question that says, is there legal remedies for wells that have gone dry? So we're not giving you legal advice, but one of the things I will tell you that you might consider approaching, or, like I had mentioned earlier, Minnesota's kind of late to the game in this data center development trend or craze or whatever we want to call it, right? So one of the things we've been pretty diligent about is reaching out to colleagues across the country and trying to learn from their mistakes. And even some of the things we've done in some of our other works, I think what you can do when you're working with a city or a county is you can work with your county commissioners and your zoning boards, and you can have conditions on these projects. And those conditions can be a variety of things, but one of the conditions you can do, and we've seen this in other types of projects, is you can have a bond put up for such things as wells. A lot of times, let's face it, these companies that are proposing these data center projects are the wealthiest companies in the world. We don't need to give them tax breaks. We don't need to give them financial incentives. We don't need to give our water away. And if we're really worried about abandoned infrastructure, or if we're worried about needing new infrastructure and not putting it on the burden on the backs of ratepayers, whether it's the energy folks or it's the water utility, these are things that you can have as conditions for these permits to be passed and these projects to be built. And so you could have a bond that landowners that have wells could access in the event that there was a problem. I mean, that might be something that you consider as an option or a condition of the development.
Yeah. I don't know if you know the answer to this one, Peg. In a rural situation, how is discharge handled without a water treatment facility? I do not know the answer to that.
Oh, they would have to get a permit. Discharge permits are from PCA. So in Minnesota anyway, can't really speak to it in other parts of the country, but in Minnesota, they would have to have a permit from the Minnesota Pollution Control Agency. Good question.
Very good question.
As I mentioned before, though, if they're treating the water to use it, as a condition of the project, you can have them treat the water before they discharge it so that it's better than they got it. That is one thing that you can do, and we've seen that in other parts of the country.
Great. And then the last one of the bunch that came in is the evaporation of the water clean for our environment?
Well, I don't know. That is a good question. Depends on what's in the water, right? If it's just straight pure water, it likely couldn't be too terribly bad, but we don't know what's in the water when it's evaporating. So that would be my best take on it, Sarah.
Yeah, and we can check in with Hannah too. Oh, great. Another question. Okay, let me read this real quick. I'm gonna maybe just skip ahead to the last part of the question. Just kind of speaking to the fact that there are lots of different folks from all political parties kind of weighing in on this, both for and against. So does this indicate that we can appeal to both liberals and conservatives when trying to limit the establishment of so many of them being hyperscale data centers? And I think, yes, I think it really, because data centers touch so many different facets of life. I mean, we're only doing one webinar on water. We have several others, and those are just a couple of the things that seem most obvious to us that we've heard folks talk about, that there's something for everybody to kind of understand and feel connected to and to be concerned about, or have questions about. And so, yes, it doesn't seem to matter kind of where you lie on the political spectrum. People have questions, people are for them, against them, just kind of depending on their own preferences and beliefs of kind of what the future should look like.
Yeah. I would also say that I think so. We know that data centers have been around for a long time, and they really do provide services that I will openly admit I use. I use it for medical reasons. I use it for commerce reasons. I use it to listen to my music in the cloud, and most of our businesses that we work at operate in the cloud. That's all a function of a data center, right? But I would say as they're racing to pop up everywhere and capture our resources, sometimes you have to really sit back and think about the people making the decisions. Like, what is their frame? Like, what are their goals and what is their frame? And I would ask you to think about this. So, city council members and county commissioners are elected officials, right? Public servants. They're elected for a period of time, and they're evaluated based on what they've been able to accomplish for their constituents. So they're, oftentimes if they are career, public servants, they think about being reelected and what accomplishments they have to make. And economic development's often a big driver and measurement of their success. And their frame and lens that they're looking through when they're making these decisions is often a very small window in the whole scheme of things. It might be 2 years, it might be 6 years, it might be 10 years. But I think that we really need to think about data centers, especially hyperscale data centers, in a bigger window. And do we have the resources to sustain them for decades? Because I don't really think they're going away. And we have limited resources, especially when we consider water, because water's needed to generate energy. They need energy and water, right? And so what do we want the future to look like for our children and our grandchildren? And do we want them to be able to have water like we have water now in Minnesota? And maybe they will, maybe they won't, but that's something to think about. And I think that having those thoughts in your mind when you're making decisions about how many data centers can be built and where they can be built is really an important thing to think about, because we have a limited amount of fresh water. We know that. And it's hard for us to actualize that in Minnesota. But if you go to the Southwest, if you go to the West Coast, they're producing water from rain clouds. They're seeding rain clouds to generate water for irrigation and things like that in the Rocky Mountain region. Colorado River Basin. And I think as time goes on and we see those stresses of water in Minnesota, I hope we've made good decisions now about data centers for the future. I don't know if that's too heavy, but I do need to say that because I do think that when you've got city officials, they have to balance a budget, and you've got these big companies coming in waving lots of dollars in front of them. And it would be hard for them not to consider that, because that is really what their goals are for their position, right? Is to be able to balance the budget for their constituents too. Greg asked a question about PFAS, and he wants to know where they're added in the water, how big amount, and is there a way to monitor this? I imagine there's always a way to monitor it. I don't know if people want to monitor it. We might want it monitored. The people using them might not want to have them monitored, but the PFAS are added to the water in the closed loop system to circulate the liquid in the cooling systems, is my understanding. And I don't know how much the amount is. These are all different size facilities. And so depending on how big the loops are and how many circuits there are and how big the campus is would indicate how much they're using. I think there's always a way to monitor things, and you could make that a condition of the permit. That's another thing that you could do.
Yep. Great. Peg, what is the current state of health of our aquifers? Do you know?
Well, Dr. Jennings would tell us. No. I think that there's Minnesota is really interesting because it has various different types of geography and soil types. And there's certain parts of the state that are more palatable for data centers, and other parts of the state, we're kind of in the south. Cure is located and based in Montevideo, which is kind of the southwest central part of the state. And we're at the bottom of the Bonanza Valley, which is a fragile aquifer, right, because of glaciation. And we've got parts of the state, like the southeast, that are karst, and the southwest actually has karst, which just kind of means shallow aquifer and sandy soils. Not great places for data centers, I'll tell you. But there are places that are better for data center development than not, and that might be why we see the concentration of them in the cities. That might be one of the reasons. We didn't actually, I don't think, say all of this, but they look for access to water, abundant water, energy. But the other critical thing is access to high-speed broadband. So that infrastructure needs to be in place, as well as transmission lines need to be in place. And then they also do use a fair amount of precious metals in their chip production for their computer processors. So those are all things that you need to consider, for sure.
Great. If folks have additional questions they want to put in, please do so. Have really great questions so far, and we'll keep track of them too. I know there are a couple that we'll follow up on. I just cleared them out so that I wouldn't keep getting distracted by seeing them.
I just want to say, I can't tell you enough that being here tonight, we really appreciate you coming and spending time with us tonight and wanting to know more. I think in the times we're in right now, these are the things we can do, is to come together and learn about these projects and figure out what individual actions we can take. And we had a slide about next steps. Really do follow your zoning board minutes, because that's where the projects start. They don't, they'll go to a county commissioner meeting or, a city council meeting. That's where they'll show up first. So it's important to follow those. It's important to stay connected with groups like Cure and our partners, because when we have petitions, respond to those petitions and put your name on it. If you check out our website as we move forward, we're gonna have talking point sheets for visiting with lawmakers. We're gonna have opportunities if you want to write letters to the editor. There's going to be all sorts of things that you can do, and I really encourage you to keep seeking out information. And we've been doing this for about 2 years at Cure on data centers. And I can't tell you the amount of stuff I've learned in those 2 years, and even things have evolved. Technology has evolved in the 2 years, and so it's always changing. And so I just encourage you to keep that healthy appetite and continue to join like-minded people and be a voice for the water, because this is the water one. I can say that. Be a voice for the water because, like I said before, nobody else is doing it. If we don't do it, who will do it? So please continue to support our work and stay connected with us. You registered tonight for the webinar, so you'll be put on the list to get the general CURE email. And CURE does a lot of different things. We cover a lot of different topics, and you'll get the general email. But if you want to know more about any of our other work, please feel free to reach out, give us a call, or send us an email, and we'll connect you with the right staff person.
Yep. Thank you to the folks putting in a couple of kind comments. There is one question I wanted to make sure. Why is there a 20-fold difference in needs for water? Are some companies not giving the indirect use of water for energy production? Yes, is the short answer. Yes, I think so. That's the other problem. So much like how I was saying, there isn't a well-defined or accepted definition for hyperscale data center. There's also no standardized method of what you need to report, what a company has to report, what they choose to report, and how they report it, how often, how are they measuring it. So these are kind of things that you have to, advocates have kind of had to back our way into to try and figure out, because often that's not included in the discussion, although it really should be if we're wanting to look at the whole picture. Great question.
You know, one thing I would say, and I failed to say earlier, I apologize, is that as a result of the legislation last year, one of the things that the Department of Commerce and the Department DNR worked together with the Deed First Business Stop, I think is what it's called, is they created a large water user application, I guess is the right word. And it's 1.5 pages long, and it's primarily focused on data centers, and it asks a lot of questions. There's a few gaps in where they could ask a few more questions, but they have just started that this last year. And the hope is that when somebody comes to the Department of Commerce and is thinking about coming to the state, especially these large companies typically tend to take that route, that they would have them fill out this form. I don't believe, I could be wrong, but I don't believe it's mandatory that they fill out the form. I think that, is that right, Sarah? I can't remember.
So what it's optional for the department to require. Yes. In short, yes. If they ask them to fill it out, they have to, but it's optional for the DNR responsible government, yes, to do so in the first place. Yes.
And they've been gathering information while it's in the inquiry stage. It's not part of the public record, so we can't access it. But once they file for a permit, then we can apply to get the information and know more about the project. But I guess the point in raising it is they're trying to do better. They're realizing that this is a huge concern, and they want to do better in Minnesota. And so we're just a little slow getting out of the gate, but they're making efforts. So I didn't want to forget to mention that. So Elizabeth asked how many listeners signed on tonight. I think it was in the high 30s, maybe. We had about just over 100 people signed up tonight. And it is Wednesday night, and like the weather was really bad. The schools in our area got closed today at noon. So there could be a variety of reasons, but we do record it, and a lot of folks just get the recording and watch it when they're able to, and we appreciate that too. Again, thank you everyone for joining us.